continuing on with Lecture 19, here we are with the reign of Gaius, or the reign of Caligula, as he becomes known as. And so, he likely killed his uncle Tiberius, possibly for the whole being raped as a child by Tiberius, but also definitely because he wanted to become emperor and was named as his heir, right? Also, in addition to him killing Tiberius, he was actually very cruel in other things. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those cruelty acts that he committed. And so, one of the things that he would commonly do was he would ask prominent Romans, such as advisors, senators, members of the royal court, and things like that, or the imperial court rather, questions that he knew the answer that he thought was right was actually wrong. He would ask like, oh, what color is the sky today? I think it's purple, even though obviously it's blue, right? And so he would ask Romans, and he's like, oh, don't you think the sky is a beautiful purple today? And if they said no, or no, it's blue, dead. Things like that. That's just one example. He also had prominent Romans killed, such as, senators, generals, etc., killed if they disagreed with him on anything. Anything at all. If they looked at him wrong, Praetorian guards were there, ready, and he would just basically point at them and have them killed. Or have them taken from their homes in the middle of the day and, dealt with then. He would immediately then, after killing that one member of the Roman society, invite the relatives to dinner, usually the same day after killing that person. And so he would commonly ask the parents of a prominent senator or the son of a prominent senator or something like that had just been killed or whatever to come to dinner. And then ask how the dead person is doing during dinner with those people. And again, if they kind of showed any emotion that their relative or friend or family member was dead, then they would also be executed. However, if their answer was, oh, the person's doing fine, then they were spared. He was absolutely cruel. He also was known for the lavish orgies. A lot of people think Rome had constantly big giant parties with lots of sex going on and stuff like that. That was simply untrue for the most part. However, during Gaius's reign, or Caligula's reign, it was very much true, with these lavish orgies. He also slept with his sisters. He had about 3 sisters, I believed, and slept with all of them. He also kind of liked to have them marry off to different members of his own family and kind of force them into different arranged marriages and stuff like that. Eventually, about a year or two into his reign, around 37 to 38, give or take, he ends up actually getting very ill. We're not sure if he was poisoned by one of his advisors trying to kill him off, or another family member, maybe even one of his sisters, but we do know that he became ill and slipped into a possible coma. He was only in a coma or possible coma for a few days, if at that, and when he awoke, he didn't just awake kind of with like, oh, everything's fine, I feel off. No, he actually awoke saying that he was Jupiter, that he was the god Jupiter. Very similar to the whole idea that Agrippa Postumus thought he was Neptune. Okay, and of course Jupiter, the god Jupiter, is Zeus by the Greeks. Okay, Zeus in the Greeks, Jupiter in the Romans. And what we do know is that immediately after he started calling himself Jupiter, he was even crazier than before, and almost every single ancient historical source, even the ones of the day, describe him as completely insane, which is kind of a lot. A lot of these sources, kind of allude to all the crazy things that some of these emperors do, but they never flat out say the person is insane. No, the historical records about Gaius Caligula all say that he was flat out insane. Give or take 1 or 2. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about some of his other accomplishments. During some of these accomplishments, he ends up actually conquering part of Germany. Well, his troops do. He didn't. He kind of was at home and kind of took credit for it. However, he did decide that he was actually going to go and invade England, okay, or Britannia, former Oceanus, remember? And so he wanted to add Britain to the Roman Empire. And so he traveled to the English Channel. So if we travel all the way back to this map here, he traveled up to this area here, the coast of Gaul, or coast of France, right across from Britain, right? From Oceanus, or Britain. Or Britannia, as it does eventually become known as under the Romans, when eventually the Romans do conquer it. However, under Caligula, they do not conquer it. And the reason why is because immediately as he's about to order all of his men into their ships to cross the English Channel, a storm starts brewing, and the waves start getting very disruptive. And he decides that it is not able to be crossed, that the English Channel won't be crossed, and instead looks at his generals and says, Neptune hates me. My brother Neptune hates me, because Jupiter was the brother of Neptune. And so he actually takes this as an attack against him by one of the gods. And he orders his men, his generals, to order their men, the legions, into the sea to attack Neptune in revenge. And at first, the generals look at him like he must be crazy, but then they also look at him as he's basically telling his Praetorian Guard to start taking out their swords to kill the generals if they don't agree, and so the generals immediately order their troops to walk about knee-depth in the water of the English Channel, okay, at the beach, and they are then to take out their swords and start slapping and attacking Neptune, meaning the sea. And so you can kind of imagine this in your head that literally thousands of soldiers are ready to get on ships and boats to go across this 20-mile English Channel, 20-mile wide English Channel to invade another country, to invade Britain and fight a bunch of barbarians. And instead they're being told, oh, we can't go because Neptune hates the emperor. You need to go and make a showing of killing Neptune or fighting Neptune. And they literally walked knee-deep into the water, thousands of troops, like 10,000 or more troops at once, walked knee-deep into the water, took out their swords, and started slapping the water with their swords. It's quite hysterical if you think about it, but quite nuts. He immediately writes back to the Senate and tells them that he wants a triumph prepared for him when he gets back to Rome from Gaul, because he has just scored a great victory. He doesn't tell them what his victory is, and he doesn't tell them that they never made it across the English Channel. He's called that plan off, because he's just all of a sudden conquered Neptune. Well, he doesn't tell them that. And so when he has his triumph and rides on his chariot back into Rome, right behind him is dozens of these carts, big wagons, filled with seashells. Just tiny little seashells, as well as larger seashells, like big, like fist-sized ones and things like that, and other big conch shells from like crabs and things like that. But it's carts upon carts or wagons upon wagons full of seashells. That's what his triumph is. All these other triumphs that had been done, it's carts and wagons full of gold or silver. But for him, seashells. And of course, the Senate is absolutely outraged that this happened. But they know if they do anything, he'll kill them. He also end up coming up with ideas that that anyone against him needs to be executed immediately. Anyone that could be a threat to him must be executed immediately, even if they're not actually against him, but a possible threat. At one point during one of his orgies or during one of his relationships with one of his sisters, he ends up actually impregnating her. And when he finds out that she is pregnant, he actually kills her with a sword to the stomach, because he is afraid that his offspring will be a demigod, because he himself is the god Jupiter, and that young son might be able to grow up and kill him. Again, he's absolutely nuts, but people are forced to listen to him because he's got 9,000 Praetorian Guard members that he's constantly paying to make sure that they do what he says, and that everybody else does what he says. Eventually, the Senate starts speaking out against him, and speaking out against him for killing his sister, and also the triumph that was a complete disaster. And so at that point, he basically says, well, if you don't like it, I will make my horse Incitatus, that was his horse's name, a senator or a consul, my co-consul. I will just declare him as a senator or a co-consul member. And he does this kind of to basically show that he doesn't respect the Senate at all, as well as to threaten them and say, I'm going to do what I want, and you can't stop me. He doesn't eventually do so, but he threatens to do so. In 41 CE, even the Praetorian Guard were tired of him. And finally, one day during a party at the palace, the Praetorian Guard decide that they're going to take matters into their own hands, and they actually start executing not only Gaius Caligula himself, but members of the imperial family. And they actually start killing every member of the imperial family they can find, until they end up finding one of the members of the family hiding behind a curtain. And that man is a young man named Claudius, who at the time wasn't actually all that young. So let's talk a little bit about Claudius. He was born actually in the year 10 BCE. And so by the year 41 CE, he was actually about 50 years old. So quite old, right? And he will live until the year 54 CE. Okay, so he's emperor for about 14 years. We'll talk about that in a moment. He was Gaius, or Caligula's, uncle. Okay, he was another uncle. He was basically a cousin of Tiberius, and so Caligula's other uncle. Okay, and most people took him as a joke, because he had many physical issues. One of his major physical issues was he had a stutter, that he would constantly start talking and then not be able to finish entire words, let alone sentences. He also had a major limp, because one of his feet was kind of deformed when he was growing up, or injured when he was growing up, and so he constantly had this limp. And it was never able to be fixed as a child. It only ever got worse when he was an adult. And so people kind of regarded him as a fool because he couldn't talk right, and he couldn't even walk right, was basically their thoughts about him. And so the imperial family, not just his own family, the imperial family, because he is a member of the imperial family, as well as the Praetorian Guard and the Senate, all thought he was a complete and utter joke. And in some ways, young Claudius, as he started reaching teenage years and seeing members like his cousin Drusus, Tiberius's son, get poisoned and killed, as well as the paranoia set in by Tiberius, he kind of decided to play up some of these issues. He actually played up his limp even more as an adult. He played up his stutter a lot more as an adult, and we know that because later on, he actually is able to talk correctly without a stutter, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it seems that he wasn't actually as infirm as many people thought he was, and he did it to basically survive, because everyone around him that was, capable and a possible threat to becoming emperor were being killed left and right, or being worried by people like Tiberius and Caligula that they might try to kill them, And so Claudius kind of kept his head down and acted the part to get away with it. Well, eventually the Praetorian Guard, when they see him, they think the same thing, that this guy isn't a threat, he's a joke. Let's make him emperor. And so the Praetorian Guard immediately decide to make him an emperor. And they basically do it again as a joke. They're like, oh, this would be hilarious. Instead of killing all the rest of the family members, just make him emperor. And so he becomes puppet emperor, as they think, that he will just be a puppet emperor. And the Senate immediately goes, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's have this guy in charge, because we as the Senate will basically be pulling all the strings as in charge now again. We've not had much power since Augustus took over. And now it's our time, finally, to be in charge again of the empire. And so the Senate starts agreeing to this, and now all that's really required is the army. And the army just kind of goes, yeah, sure. As long as our generals are fine with it, it's okay. And so the generals kind of like, yeah, okay, fine, the Senate and Praetorian Guard are okay with it, let's do it. Well, eventually, Claudius shows his real colors, and actually takes over as real emperor. And he becomes emperor immediately in 41 CE when they claim him as emperor as a puppet, but he actually takes power right away, because he starts bribing the members of the Praetorian Guard, and starts talking normally in front of them. He was actually very intelligent. He actually could speak perfectly well in front of an audience. It was one-on-one conversations where he would end up struggling to get words out and start stuttering. And the worst thing is people didn't give him a chance to correct himself during a sentence. They would just kind of cut him off mid-sentence. And so they were very cruel to him growing up, and when he got into later years, he just realized, well, they're just going to ignore me. And so it worked. But now that he was proclaimed emperor, and he had the money and power, he started actually bribing people and telling them, look, I'm going to be in charge now, and showing that he could actually lead. And so while the Praetorian Guard and Senate made him a puppet, he wasn't a puppet. He was a real emperor. And so let's talk a little bit more about him. He was actually mentored by the historian Livy, that we have mentioned multiple times in this course already, at different times, okay? Livy was a historian of the Roman Empire and Roman Republic, and Livy wrote multiple history books and documents that last today, and he was directly responsible for most of Claudius's education. And so Claudius was very educated by Livy. Claudius himself wrote a history of the Etruscan people. The Etruscans, remember them? Okay, that were part of Italy originally before the Romans. He wrote a history about them. This history book about the Etruscans no longer lasts today. But there are many, many references about Claudius's history of the Etruscans, as it was known as, okay, in multiple Roman documents later on that talk about the early history of Rome as well as the Etruscan people. And so we know it must have been useful because, and quite well written by Claudius, and it was quite well done, because otherwise they wouldn't be referencing it in other books. Like if you do a book report, you only usually use other books that are really good, right? If you see two books and one's not so good and one's like awesome, you're going to use the awesome one as your reference, right? For all of your citations and stuff when you're writing a report or something. And so it must have been good. And so it talks more to his intelligence. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of his other things. Remember during Julius Caesar's reign how he planned on building the port of Ostia and he never got a chance to because he was killed on the Ides of March? Well, eventually Claudius decided to finally follow through with that about, 60 plus years later, right? Or closer to 70 years later, to 100 years later. And so he planned and built the harbor of Ostia. Okay, Ostia was actually finally bought. And as you can see, the city of Rome here in the port of Ostia, and there's the little Tiber River. And here, if you look out at it, here's the Tiber River going up this way, and here is this port city here. The port of Ostia here, and a harbor built, some of Ostia here, and part of Ostia here. And you can see kind of like this little stone wall around it to protect ships, and ships would actually go in this area right here, okay, and tie up because the heavy waves of the ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea or Tyrrhenian Sea, whichever one you want to call it, wouldn't really affect it because of the big giant concrete seawalls. And so he actually had this underwater concrete poured with wooden barricades around the concrete, and then once it was hard, they removed the wood, and then the concrete would set in the water even stronger over time, because we've talked about that during the culture lecture. So he actually made this port town on the edge of the Tiber River for the Roman city, which, his great ancestor, Julius Caesar, had planned to do and never got around to it. He also had many other building projects. He built many roads throughout all of Italy, as well as the rest of the empire, but mostly Italy, because he found out that a lot of the roads had begun to decay and hadn't been upkept by Caligula and Tiberius because they were busy doing other things and spending their money elsewhere. And so he decided to actually start realizing that transportation in Italy was breaking down, and that the farms and all of the different areas in Italy were not being able to get products to Rome as fast as they used to. And so he started having roads built, he started having canals dug, where it was basically rivers or water passages dug for by people to basically transport boats along them, so canals, as well as built reservoirs and 2 major aqueducts, okay? So 2 major incredible aqueducts, not just like a couple miles of aqueduct, but like 100 to 200 mile long aqueducts, okay, were built during his period, during his reign. He also even drained a lake in the middle of Italy that, at that point, Italy was running out of farmland, and he decided that, or arable farmland that was able to be grown well at, and he decided that he was going to drain the lake completely, use the water from the lake to irrigate different areas, and then use that entire, lake's surface where the lake had been as farmland, because it was, good soil. It had never been used, and so it was possibly fertile. So quite ingenious. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about some of his other accomplishments and the end of his life. And so he succeeded actually in conquering Britain. He actually led legions to Britain successfully and was not stopped by Neptune or a storm, like Claudius was, or Caligula was, sorry. He even had a triumph when he returned to Rome, in honor of him conquering Britannia. Now, did he actually conquer Britannia himself? No, he probably went very briefly, kind of supervised and had all of the generals do it for him, right? And the troops do it for him. But he gets the credit for it. Let's talk a little bit about his personal life, because it's going to happen to be where his fate lies. Well, he has 4 wives. His first wife, Plautia, was divorced due to multiple affairs and also the fact that Plautia plotted and also eventually killed her own sister. There was a bit of an argument between the 2 sisters, and Plautia decided to knock her sister off, and so that happened, and Claudius finds out about it, as well as finds out that Plautia was basically sleeping around on him, and so Plautia has to be divorced. And so, by Plautia. She lives, she's just divorced. Aelia is his next wife, and this divorce is due to mental abuse. And this is during, I believe, Caligula's reign, when he was alive during Caligula's reign, or Tiberius's reign. And mental abuse basically is the issue and reason for the divorce, and it's likely because he was playing up the whole idea of being stuttering and limping all the time, and he did have a limp. It wasn't as bad as he made it seem, at times, and so she probably made fun of him for it, as did almost everybody in the royal family, and so eventually he just decided to grow tired of it and got rid of her by divorcing her. Of course, she lived afterwards. Messalina, however, was the next one. While Claudius was supervising the building of the port of Ostia, he was gone for weeks, if not months at a time, watching it be built. And yes, it's only 20 miles away from Rome, okay? 20 to 27 miles away from the city of Rome. But he wasn't going to be traveling back and forth every single day. He would spend weeks here in Ostia making sure the construction was doing well. Same with the construction when he was doing with the lake in Italy. And eventually, during one of these multiple-day excursions and multiple-week excursions, Messalina decided to have a contest. And she challenged the best prostitute in the entire city of Rome to a challenge, a 24-hour challenge, that who can sleep with the most partners, or satisfy the most partners, in 24 hours. And so a lot of historians call this the whore-off, as it's between Messalina and the head prostitute of Rome, and Messalina actually wins this contest, I guess you could call it winning, with a whopping 25 partners across 24 hours satisfied. And so Messalina kind of was doing this while Claudius was out of town, and it became quite a contest. People were lining up at the palace, or wherever the villa was where she was doing this, and the head prostitute in the next room, and it kind of spread around all of the city of Rome that this was going on. And so when Claudius comes back from his trip, his advisors and members of the Senate tell him, "You've got to get rid of this woman. She's basically made you a laughingstock in the entire city of Rome. Everyone knows about this contest," and explained what happened to him, and he of course, divorces her. I think she is executed for it or thrown in jail. I'm not exactly sure. Nothing is ever heard about Messalina after this contest and this divorce. Finally, he marries a fourth time to a young woman named Agrippina the Younger, who is actually Caligula's sister. Okay, Caligula's sister. It is one of the sisters that, yes, Caligula slept with. He slept with all of them, but it is one of the ones that survived Caligula's reign. The others didn't. Agrippina the Younger had already been married beforehand and had a young child named Nero, a boy named Nero. Claudius, at this point, had a young son named Britannicus. Okay, Britannicus, from a previous marriage. I'm not sure which of these marriages was Britannicus' son born to, but Britannicus was Claudius's already son. So at this point, Claudius adopts Nero, because it is the son of Agrippina the Younger, and so he raises both Nero and Britannicus as brothers. Eventually, Claudius starts realizing that he is getting older, and he needs to make a decision on who will be his heir. Agrippina the Younger has been lobbying for her son Nero to be heir, but Claudius already has his own genetic son himself, and that's Britannicus, named after, of course, conquering Britain, right? And so Britannicus is going to be named as heir. However, Agrippina pushes the issue, and so Claudius decides that the two of them will rule together. Nero and Britannicus. Well, almost within a month or so of Claudius signing his will saying that both Nero and Britannicus will rule together, Claudius dies in 54 BCE after eating poisoned mushrooms, something that Agrippina personally fed him that night. And it is actually quite well known that Agrippina was actually in the process of being divorced by Claudius. Claudius had found out that Agrippina was kind of not liking him at this point and had really been using him to name her son as the heir, and so he really wanted possibly rid of her, and so he was in the process of the paperwork to get divorce from her. And we know this from the historian Suetonius, which we've mentioned a couple times already in this class. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us this. However, Agrippina was able to poison Claudius, and he dies a day or so later from these poisonous mushrooms. And so, who gets to rule? Well, Nero and Britannicus would. They would rule together. However, 13-year-old Britannicus, who's only 13 years old at this time, young Britannicus, falls ill and dies in 55 CE, the following year, but it's actually only 4 months after his father's death. And Britannicus, of course, does not recover from his illness and dies, and it was likely poisoning, probably by mushrooms. And so, all these poisonings from Drusus and others, drugs, right? Drugs, that's where the drugs of this sex rock and roll lecture comes in. So let's talk about Nero and what happens after him in the next lecture.